What's up, everybody? Dave here, back with the third installment of my Caro-Kann opening series. Hopefully from the first two, you guys have gotten a sense for how deep my passion for the Caro-Kann is, and I'm excited to get into the infamous exchange variation. In the past two videos, we have talked about the knight c3 variation in this very position, and the advanced variation, both of which are incredibly popular. However, if you play the Caro-Kann, you're also going to get a lot of people who want to simplify the position, make it boring, and exchange the pawns. However, unlike the exchange French, the exchange Caro-Kann actually does not produce a symmetrical position, so it's not so boring after all. We are missing our c-pawn and white's missing his e-pawn, meaning that the position is imbalanced. There's at least one imbalance in this position already. Now, the main move here for white is bishop to d3, and we're going to get into that. However, we are making this video at the request of a student and patron who donated $10 to the channel for me to make this video. So he mentioned that a lot of beginner players don't actually play this bishop to d3 move, and instead they play some weird moves on move 4, like bishop to b5 check, queen to f3, even knight to c3, you'll see from time to time. And I'm going to talk about the merits of each of these moves and the drawbacks. Little spoiler, there are more drawbacks than there are merits. But let's talk about bishop to d3 first, the main move here. Now, what I'm going to recommend to you is a little bit of an unorthodox setup. Knight c3 is the knight to c6 is the right move here, attacking the d4 pawn, after which white should go c3. And now one of black's main ideas in this position is to go queen c7 and e5. And you get this position where you have an isolated d pawn. You oftentimes lose this pawn, but you get a lot of active play. For example, queen c7, knight e2, e5. You could get a line like this: takes, bishop b5 check. And the reason I'm just going through this very quickly is because this is not the variation that I'm actually going to recommend, because this pawn gambit is quite effective against many lower rated players. But if you really want to play the Caro-Kann seriously, you're not going to want to gambit a pawn every time you play the exchange variation. So instead of queen to c7, I'm actually going to recommend this line with pawn to g6. And this line is one that I've been playing for a very long time, and I absolutely love it. The whole point of this line is we are going to accept doubled f-pawns with black. And you might be wondering, how are we going to double our f-pawns? It's not the Tartic Tower. It's not so easy to force your opponent to take your knight here and you take back. Well, the way we're going to do it is bishop to f5. We're going to incite this capture. And now we're going to claim that, okay, although you've doubled our pawns and our structure is slightly worse, we're actually going to take advantage of this. Knight to f6. Now, there are two main factors here. The first is that we opened the g-file for our rook, and the second is that we've opened up this juicy e4 square for our knight. So after rook to e1, we can simply play natural moves, rook to g8, bishop d6, and eventually our knight will hop to this wonderful e4 square, and everything is really going our way in this position. We have a beautiful knight on e4, we have the g-file for our rook, we're one move away from just castling and getting out of any dodge. Our king could be in the center, so we have a good position. This is the main line of the exchange variation that I want to show you. So remember, go knight c6 to attack your opponent's pawn on d4, then go pawn to g6, not queen to c7. We're actually going to promote that variation right there. Pawn to g6 and get your opponents to double your f-pawns. And just play based on the principles that I just provided you. Occupy the g-file with your rook and the e4 square for your knight, just like this. Hopefully that's helpful for the main line in the exchange variation. However, there are other options that your opponent has in this very position. So we're going to go over a couple of the side variations now. The first and most tempting to most beginner players is bishop to b5 check. And this move is actually not all that. You can just block it with the knight, and it's tough to put more pressure on this knight. For example, if white plays knight to f3 and tries to get the knight into e5, we can simply go bishop to g4, pinning the knight to the white queen. And this is a position that I've gotten against a lower rated friend of mine who likes to play this against me. He'll put his knight on c3, I'll put my knight here. He'll hit my bishop, we'll trade, and we'll get a position just like this, where we castle, I push his bishop away, he takes, and it's knight, bishop, 2 rooks and a queen versus knight, bishop, 2 rooks and a queen, and we have the same color bishop, so it seems very, very level, equal, but I think black is the one who's playing for something here, because we have the open b file for our rook can swing to b8 pretty easily, and we also have this c5 move, disrupting white's center. And notice, after a continuation like this, c5, takes, we end up having both of our center pawns while white has 0 of his center pawns, which is why I don't believe that the bishop b5 variation carries much merit to it. There are some other options, though, in addition to bishop d3 and bishop to b5. If you go queen to f3, to be honest, this is not something I've ever faced, but because it was brought up to me as a variation that white sometimes plays, I figure I'll go over it. Basically, what you're doing when you play queen f3 is you're putting your queen on a vulnerable square where it can be attacked easily by knight f6, bishop g4, and you're taking away a good square from your own knight. So if you're playing with the white pieces here, you want your knight to come to f3, but you're blocking this by putting your queen there. So for example, if we play knight to c6, knight to f6, now after only a couple moves, it becomes apparent that, yeah, this queen on f3 is not placed ideally. The fourth move on move 4 that I'll talk about here is knight to c3. I've seen this a couple times, especially when I was at the lower level. No one really plays it against me these days, but I figure I'll mention it. You can simply bring out your knights like this, and white is violating a basic opening principle while we're not. They're developing their queenside knight in front of their pawn. Notice that our c-pawn is gone because we traded it early on, but white's c-pawn is still there. He's developing his knight in front of his pawn, making this c-pawn very ineffective. So after all 4 knights come out, we're actually already slightly better. We can get a position like this, bishop to g4, pinning this knight, and a very standard Caro-Kann position right here, in which I would definitely favor black. We have ideas like castling and going for the simple minority attack. So a6, if he pushes us away, so be it. We just go for b5 and push on this side of the board. Okay, so those are the main variations in the exchange that you should look out for. The last 3 that I talked about, knight to c3, bishop to b5, and queen to f3, are primarily, if you're at the beginner level, you'll probably see these at the under 1400 level, I want to say. But if you're a more advanced player, then primarily look out for bishop to d3. Now, one more critical thing that I'll mention here, and I'll put it as something that's sort of separate from the traditional exchange variation, is the Pan of Bovinic Attack, with c4 in this position after the exchange. Now, a lot of white players who know their stuff and are booked up on their theory will go for the Pan of Bovinic Attack. In response, you can play knight to f6, and here black has 3 main options. You can go e6, this is what a lot of top grandmasters do. You can go knight to c6, this is an older variation, or you can go pawn to g6. These are the 3 moves here, and I'll let you guys investigate this a bit more on your own to decide which one is best for you. But I can personally recommend, if you want a very simple position, go for e6, and you can get this very, very simple setup where you're playing against the isolated pawn. Your opponent has the Isolani on d4, and you basically just want to play against it, maybe plant a piece on d5, play b6, bishop b7, just simple play like this. But if you want a more aggressive game, I would recommend going for g6. And this actually looks like a Grunfeld of sorts, for those of you who are familiar with the Grunfeld defense for the black pieces, where you go g6 and then d5. The only difference here is that these 2 pawns are off the board, and it actually goes a little bit in our favor that the position is simplified this way. Now, white can go queen to b3 and grab our pawn, but we simply treat it as a sacrifice. Our plan to get it back being relatively simple, we want to go knight to a6, bring this knight back to c7, and we're going to gang up all our pieces on that pawn. Eventually, we're going to get enough pieces attacking it that we can win it. And the key here is push away the knight, then win the pawn. So if this was a little bit fast for you, I encourage you to rewind through the video and go through the moves. Maybe play over the moves on your own board. I do not want to make this video too long, and I know that a lot of exchange players will opt for traditional bishop d3 stuff and not the Pan of Bovinic. So I've kind of skipped through this a little bit, but make sure that if you're playing the Caro-Kann, you know this Pan of Bovinic. And if you do choose to go for the slightly more aggressive g6 variation, know your stuff, know how to get back this pawn. The primary plan is to play this setup with the bishop on b7, trying to win back this pawn. But if you're worried about falling into certain traps, like for example, if you play b6 too early, then you can fall into some sort of d6 trap on this diagonal, so you don't want to play it prematurely. If you want to avoid all of this, I'd recommend simply going for queen to b6. And after this exchange, black is completely fine. We're going to win back our pawn, and we're going to be okay with this position. So that's what I recommend against the Pan of Bovinic. To recap, if you want something super solid and safe, go for e6 here. If you want something a little more dangerous, play this g6 variation that's similar to the Grunfeld. Give up the pawn, and simply trade off the queens with queen to b6. With the goal of winning this d-pawn back eventually. Knight to b4 and rook to d8. Okay, so that just about concludes what I wanted to say about the exchange variation in the Caro-Kann. I hope this video has been helpful to everybody. If it has, please like the video, comment, and don't forget to subscribe. We're currently on the road to 1,000 subscribers, and every subscription helps a ton. In the meanwhile, I will see you guys later. I'll see you in the next one. I look forward to rounding out this Caro-Kann series.